Hello, welcome. Come on in, find a seat. I'm really glad you're here today. I'm going to be talking about Sherlock Holmes, sort of. Sort of. It just so happens that here in Cleveland, Ohio, we had our own Sherlock Holmes figure. And his name was John George SPENZER, and he would have been very proud of us for pronouncing all three names. Thought quite a bit about himself, and I'm going to give you some of his history. I'm going to talk about how he solved crimes right here in Cleveland, Ohio at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But the fun thing about this is based on facts. I work at the Dittrich Medical History Museum, which is across the street from Severance Hall down in University Circle on Case Western's campus. I like to call it Severance Light. It kind of looks like Severance. It's built like a tank, actually, on the inside. We have 175,000 artifacts from the medical past. And some of them might surprise you. For instance, we have the world's largest contraception museum. We have old X-ray equipment and X-ray tables, static electricity generators, and a great deal on antiseptic medicine, childbirth, diagnostic tools. And in the basement, there were 13 boxes that I had the luck to get to go through and discover this man called John George SPENZER. Now, Cleveland's Sherlock was a forensic toxicologist. So he was a medical doctor. And he was a pretty interesting fellow, and he thought quite a bit about himself as well. He graduated with his medical degree at the age of 16. And they wouldn't let him have it because he was too young to practice medicine, in their opinion. So he said, fine, and he went and got a PhD in 2 years in Germany, in German, just cause. Then he became a fellow at the Royal College, or at the Surgeon Society in France. And then he came back to Cleveland and he set up shop, and he brought with him some letterhead to set up shop, and it just said expert at the top. Just expert in things. So he's a lot of fun to read about and research, but what he was most interesting for, in some ways, was his attention to detail. The tiniest little details mattered a lot, because what you might not know is that early toxicologists were not always specialists in the crime scene. They were interested in what was happening in the body. They didn't necessarily think to look for dust or fingerprints or other things at the crime scene itself. Not in the 19th century. That changes over time. But he was one of the people, because he was trained in Germany, he had seen a different kind of approach. And in Germany, there was a forensic toxicologist and specialist who was really interested in a four-letter word: dust. He had realized that there was a whole world in dirt. And you could find out all kinds of fun things about people. So we're going to start off talking about how it's not so elementary, actually, today. When I finish my talk, I'm going to bring up Nicole here, who works in forensic anthropology, and we'll have a short panel discussion on what it's like to do forensic anthropology, what forensics is kind of like today, and then we'll open it up to a discussion with all of you. So Sherlock. I'm a big fan of Sherlock Holmes. I love Sherlock paraphernalia. If you were at the Natural History Museum in February for the Poison exhibit, I was dressed as Sherlock Holmes for 4 hours. I talked to 500 people. I had an accent for the first 2 hours, but some things you just can't keep up. I have a very fetching hat. So Sherlock and Watson together are what we're used to thinking about this. And now we've got a lot of modern takes on how Sherlock and Watson work together. But medicine, believe it or not, was always a part of this story. And medicine is a big part of forensic even still. So if you go all the way back to what is forensics? Does anybody know what's forensics typically? What's it a study of? Nicole, you can't answer. Anyone want to guess? You're like, absolutely not. This is being filmed. Are you crazy? Okay, criminal science, right. It's a deduction, right? We're interested in looking at the small pieces and trying to come up with solutions, and that makes sense. So if you go back, all the way back to Archimedes, he has a eureka moment. And this eureka moment is quite a funny story. He was trying to figure out how to weigh something without actually weighing it. And he got to deciding that you could displace things in the bath. So he gets into the bathtub full of water. He realizes it displaces a certain amount of water, and he thinks, oh, this is volume. And he was so excited, he shouted Eureka and supposedly runs through the streets, kind of forgetting to put his clothes on first. And so when people talk about a Eureka moment, it's this method of realizing that small details and measurements can actually lead to answers. So there is a text from 1242, that's not a page number, that's a year, and that is called Washing Away Wrongs. It's in Chinese, and it was basically a way of looking at certain murder weapons to figure out what had happened. A famous one being someone was murdered with a sai, not a, but big choppy equipment. And afterwards, they couldn't tell who had committed the murder, so he said, bring all the sais out and lay them in the sun. And whichever one the flies gather on, that will let us know who the killer was. The other thing that Washing Away of Wrongs talks about is how to tell the difference between a strangling victim and a drowning victim. So we've been working on this for a long time. How do you know for sure that somebody didn't die of natural causes? Murder in Bologna in 1302. Most importantly, though, 1447, a duke recognized by his teeth. So dental forensics going back a lot further than most people think. But it isn't till we get to arsenic in 1775 that things really start to get interesting for toxicology as a field. We have some arsenic at the museum. Well, it's under lock and key, but we have examples of arsenic at the museum. It's colorless, it's odorless, it's tasteless, almost tasteless, a little bit bitter, and it's very effective at killing people. But it kills people in a very specific way, and it looks a lot like cholera. That makes it very handy if you're trying to get rid of, say, your family members. And in fact, they called it the inheritor's powder. Clever. It mixed easily in food and drink. And essentially, it causes your body great sorrow. Cholera could kill people very quickly. You died basically of dehydration because things were just coming out of your body at a rate you could not put them back in. And there we go. There's a picture of cholera before and after. It's called the Sick Rose, and it looks a little bit like a zombie film. But this lovely woman here who's kindly tending her ailing spouse there, that is, I think I have to have a picture of her back here too. That is Madame LaFarge, and she had a husband, but she didn't want him anymore. So he went away on a trip, and she was very clever because she thought, oh, I'm going to wait till he's out of town. And she sent him a present by mail, a little piece of cake. He got sick while he was away, came home, and she said, don't worry, honey, I will make you better. He died of cholera, but one of the people attending him noticed that she was the only one who was allowed to give him any food or drink. And also that she might have been mixing something, medicine, she said, into that food and drink. They decide to open a trial against her, and they exhume the body. They test it. No arsenic is found because the test for arsenic was very, very difficult. It's called the Marsh test. Basically, arsenic is metallic. So if you take a little piece of the body that's been poisoned and you do a lot of things to it, boiling it and burning it and etc., and then you distill that and spray it on a piece of ceramic, it will come out with like a silvery sheen. And so that's how they could test for arsenic. It's incredibly difficult to do, and if there's any kind of contamination at all, it doesn't work. So the test failed, and it looked like she might get off the hook. She was also very popular in the court case. There's a lot of drawings of her because she went into histrionics over this. Well, then they bring in Matthew ORFILA. Matthew ORFILA was sort of the best toxicologist of his time. He was very methodical. And what I love about Matthew is he was so dedicated to his work that he really sort of forgot about other people's sensibilities, like your ability to smell. So he decided to perform the test, the forensic test, in the courtroom. So they just march in with a bunch of rotting flesh. Don't worry, everybody, we got this. And they start performing the test. And lo and behold, he is actually able to prove definitively and publicly that she had poisoned her husband. Now, for any of you who are Sherlock aficionados, I know we have at least one in the room, it turns out that Sherlock has done his share of chemical analysis too. Where does Watson, in what story does Watson and Sherlock first meet? A Study in Scarlet. A Study in Scarlet, great. And Watson first meets him in a lab. And the lab is described as there's Bunsen burners, there's lots of things going on. And Sherlock is very busy looking at a specimen of blood. He wants to figure out how to recognize hemoglobin, to tell if something is blood or not. And that would have made things pretty pretty spectacularly useful in the field of toxicology. They do ultimately figure out how to do it. Sherlock is wrong in the story about how it's done, but that's okay. He's right in principle. Sherlock is actually based on a real person. Sherlock is based on a man named Joseph Bell, who was an instructor that our Arthur Conan Doyle, ostensibly our Watson figure, had gone to, and he was a surgeon. Joseph Bell was great at being able to diagnose people when they walked in the room. So they walk in and he'd be like, well, clearly you have a heart condition. And he would then, diagnose these things. And then the audience would go wild. How did you know, Dr. Bell? Oh, I'm just looking carefully. So Arthur Conan Doyle was in awe of Joseph Bell. There was also a lovely violinist that was very popular in the time, whose last name was Sherlock. So put those two things together and you have, a third thing I should mention. Watson was a doctor. I mentioned that before. Watson was a doctor, but he might not have been a very good one. He didn't have many clients. So one of the reasons that he took up writing the Sherlock stories is because if you don't have a lot of clients and you spend a lot of time staring out windows in London, you have to find a way to occupy yourself. So he begins to tell these tales. Like Matthew Orfila, Bell was very much a genius of observation and method. So two things. Observation, look carefully. But if you look carefully and you don't actually follow any method to rule out other options, it's going to be pretty hard to actually prove anything. This is from The Adventure of the Empty House. Again, Dr. John Watson was always the one telling the tale. But what if you didn't have a Watson? If you didn't have a Watson, no one would know that you were brilliant. This here is an example. This is some information about Dr. Joseph Bell. Does it look sort of familiar to those of you who are familiar with Sherlock? Lots of energy, angular features, sparkling eyes, birds instead of bees, but birds and bees. In teaching the treatment of disease and accident, Dr. Bell stated, all careful teachers have first to show the student how to recognize accurately the case. The recognition depends on acute and rapid appreciation of small points, observation, and medicine. Joseph Bell did not actually turn this towards solving crimes, but I know someone who did. Dr. John George Spenzer also was around in the late 19th century, about the same time that these stories were being published. He was trained abroad with renowned chemists. He had published all kinds of things, about 50 articles. You will probably never have heard of them because they're on things like dust and dirt and tiny little details, including how the body absorbs vitamins, which you wouldn't think was very important to forensics, but in fact it can be. Knowing how the body processes or handles things in its own tissue can tell you how long someone's been dead, what they've been poisoned of, whether or not it was in their system a long time. In the sensational Kaiser trial, a well-to-do farmer was accused of murdering his wife here in Cleveland. And basically, he said she died of food poisoning. No big deal, food poisoning. And that probably would have held water, except a young lady came forward and said, no, actually, he's my lover and he killed her for me. And it's kind of hard to overlook that sort of thing. So it goes to trial, and all the children come and they're like, no, my father could not have done this. He loved his wife. We were all made sick that night. I'm sure it was food poisoning. They put the woman on the stand. She, at one point, pulls all her hair out in front of the crowd, which is one way of proving your point. The trial goes on forever. And in the end, it's only solved because Spenzer had been part of the first autopsy, and he thought it was prudent to keep her pancreas, just in case. So in the end, he proves that he did not, in fact, kill his wife. And he proves it by showing that it was food poisoning after all. Pro tip, if you live in Cleveland in the 19th century, don't eat oysters. They were traveling a long way to get here. The expert medical testimony alone for this trial that Spenzer kept and that I have read is 869 pages. On that onion skin stuff, like really, it's giant, it's a doorstop. But he was very, very observant. So if you're talking about method and observation, we've got lots of that. By the way, this is Mr. Spenzer. He's the chap with the cane, a little bit short on stature, big on personality. This is his lab. These are some of his slides. And I find this fascinating. He was interested in blood spatter quite a long time before Dexter. He spent a lot of time looking at a microscope to be able to tell whether or not something was blood, what kinds of tissue it had in it, what sort of impurities might be there. But my favorite part, I brought some examples up here. My favorite part is that he kept all of these notebooks where he had pictures rendered, and drew some of them himself, of murder weapons, of bloody clothes, of where bullets went in and out, of what kind of vial they sent him the bullet in, with a picture of it. You know, he would have just so benefited from an iPhone. Here's one of the murder weapons. Everything, down to the details of scuff marks that appear on the gun to tell you, oh, here was a burn mark, or here was a powder burn, or here was a nick in the frame. This is what it looked like when it got, here's the handwriting that was on the, this is a level of OCD that is hard to beat. He was very, very interested in the small details. John also very much liked being in the newspaper. I know this because every time the man's name was mentioned in print, he kept it. And I know this because we have boxes and boxes of it. This is a great one. I like this one a lot. Spenzer would get on the stand and he wouldn't get down again until he had proved his point. And so, for instance, there was a case where he was trying to explain something to a jury, and at one point, the judge stops him and says, "Sir, we have no idea what you're talking about." And he looks at the judge and says, "Faulty education." Quite the guy. He is an expert, and this is a picture of them objecting to, this is Spenzer on the stand and the other side being like, "Stop talking, please, I object." But he often won. He would just stand there until you understood what he was trying painstakingly to explain to you. The Racer trial was quite interesting. Racer was accused of killing his fiancée. Basically of shooting her 3 times in the face and then throwing her out of a carriage and running over her quivering body. So, not a nice thing to do. But in the stand, everyone said, we can't convict him. We can't. Look at him. He has the face of a boy. But in fact, that face of a boy had a little bit of rusty stains on his collar that turned out, in fact, to be blood. Spenzer discovers it. Spenzer also tracks the route that the killer would have had to take, examines the shoe that the horse threw sometime along the way, and then compares it to the horse's foot that belonged to Racer. He studies the trajectory that the bullet would have entered, the facial bones, in order to show that the blood splatter would have come out at a certain degree, a certain angle, so that he could study it. It was pretty involved stuff. Racer later confesses to the crime. Turns out he had fiancés all over the place. Erie County Slayer faces death in chair. I like this one. Defense presents Dr. John George Spencer, world student. I sometimes suspect maybe he wrote some of these. He studied chemistry and toxicology under Dr. Edward Morley at Western Reserve, the Michelson and Morley experiments, him, at Western Reserve University. And after he receives his medical degree, he spends 5 years of additional study abroad in various places. As I said, again, they wouldn't let him have his degree to practice because they thought at 16 you're a bit young. So, I don't know, medical degree at 16 and then a PhD 2 years later. Well, what else would you do with your life except solve crimes for the police? I don't know. He returns to Cleveland. He teaches at the college pharmacy and later at the Cleveland College of Physicians and Surgeons, and eventually at Western Reserve in 1910. So what Case Western is today, he joined them in the legal, chemistry, and medical jurisprudence. Now, this is an interesting story. If you follow the history of forensics, you'll probably be aware of Gettler and Norris. These are the people in New York. If you read The Poisoner's Handbook by Deborah Blum or saw any of the documentaries about it. So New York gets a lot of credit for sort of starting forensics as a movement. And I admit, they were pretty great, but they weren't necessarily first. Again, it would have been great if John George Spencer had had a biographer at the time, but he was actually doing a lot of the same kinds of things. But they didn't call it forensics here. It wasn't called forensics until the New York Academy of Medicine, I believe. So it was called medical jurisprudence. So some of the reasons that he kept all of these notebooks is he essentially was very displeased with textbooks of the time. So he made his own. He also did the pictures for the front pieces because reasons. He needed hobbies. This is the toxicology one. You can come up and take a closer look later, but they're really beautiful. Maybe because there wasn't Facebook. He becomes an expert on blood and poison analysis, primarily, and that's why he ends up testifying in numerous cases. The first one that I saw, this was shortly after he sets up shop as expert, was someone asking to find out if their horses had been poisoned. So they wrote him a letter. He sends the letter back with corrections and writes in the corner, "If you cannot use grammar properly, please do not write to me." I love him so much. However, the blood expertise really is what puts him in a different category altogether, because being able to tell whether something was blood, how old the blood spots were, whose blood it might be, this is all very, very important material. Now, we didn't have blood typing the way we do today at that time, but he was basically up on all the most current and modern techniques, and he basically brought those techniques here to Cleveland. So there's a picture of Sherlock again. This is one of the diagrams I was telling you that he basically creates for the various experiments that he did, drawing them meticulously, not just to show you the results, but also how the experiment was put together in the first place. This is from Study in Scarlet. I quite like this. There was a lofty chamber lined and littered with countless bottles. There was only one student in the room who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps, he glanced round and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. "I've found it! I've found it!" he shouted to my companion, running towards us with a test tube in his hand. "I've found a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin, and by nothing else. He had discovered a gold mine. Had he discovered a gold mine, greater delight could not have shone upon his features." This is from A Study in Scarlet. This is Sherlock Holmes talking to Watson when Watson first meets him. But frankly, he was wrong about that. This doesn't happen until 1863 when you start getting some of these materials. And honestly, it still was very difficult to tell human blood from animal blood or one human's blood from another. So that test, in fact, doesn't happen until 1901. At the same time, I think it's interesting that we were already thinking about this. Even people like Arthur Conan Doyle, who himself was not a toxicologist, was interested in these materials. And Spenzer works in the period just after this and uses this new test on the Racer trial to prove that Racer killed his fiancée. So it's an example that not only was Spenzer sort of like, oh, I'm clearly the smartest person in the room, which he thought that often. I know this because I've read his journals. But also that he was interested in using the most modern things, the most modern equipment, the most modern information. Here's that test I was talking about. By the way, that's the diagram of where the murder went in the Racer case. Those are the files that show the bullet. He was a world student, indeed. What I think I'd like to bring back, or sort of take away from this, is that typically when we think about turning points in medical history or scientific history, we tend to privilege the places where that happened. And I know that a lot of amazing things happened here in Cleveland. For instance, baby formula was invented here. The first defibrillator was invented here by Claude Beck. So when you hear people shout, "clear," I always think Cleveland. Actually, the first one you couldn't use on the outside of the body, so you had to open the chest first. So it was maybe not quite as useful as the ones we use today. It also looked like spoons. If you've not seen it, you should come to my museum because it's there on the second floor. But here we have an example of something that was in fact new and fascinating and does put us on the cutting edge, and yet most people have never heard of John George Spenzer, and most people don't associate Cleveland with advances in forensic technology. You might not even associate Cleveland with Sherlock Holmes, though, to be perfectly honest, there's quite a few things I found in Spenzer's files that showed he was paying attention to Sherlock Holmes. A little rolled up piece of paper, I unfolded it, and it said, "The real Sherlock Holmes would have been a forensic toxicologist." So what I want you to leave with is an understanding that Cleveland, someday we've been talking a lot about Cleveland being on the rise. We have been an important epicenter of change for a long time. It's true in medicine. It's also true in forensics and toxicology. And one of the people who helped set up the New York program on forensics actually also taught here in Cleveland for a period of time at Western Reserve Academy. So there's a great traffic in knowledge, a great trade in knowledge between Cleveland in this early period and a lot of other places in the world where these changes were happening. And so, as you know, we had our own Sherlock figure here who was practicing new and interesting things, but he didn't have a Watson. So we also need to remember how important those Watson figures are, how important it is to the discovery and to the sharing of discovery that we write about it, that we read about it, that we take the opportunity to fund it and to support it, and research and development. This is a very medical town, and these are really important things. So the next time you read about a discovery somewhere, always remember, someone had to write that down for you to know that it was real. And so we have our own John George Spenzer world student here in Cleveland. And hopefully now you can spread that story a little wider. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Nicole to join me up here. Nicole works in forensic anthropology. I'm going to have her talk a little bit about what that is. We're going to share a few questions, and then I'm going to ask you as the audience to participate and kind of talk about your own feelings about forensics and what you think deduction and the science of deduction really means, or your favorite Sherlock anecdotes too. That's fun also. So thank you. Welcome, Nicole.
Is this on, or do I have to do something?
I think it's on.
You can hear me? Okay.
All right. So Nicole, why don't you tell them a little bit about what you do at the Natural History Museum?
So I am the curator of human health and evolutionary medicine. My training is broadly in biological anthropology and forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropology is kind of a subset of what you do as a biological anthropologist. So you examine bones, human remains. You do a lot of work in both modern and archaeological remains. So at the museum, though, specifically, I do my research. I do a lot of stable isotope analysis of diet and health. But I also am creating a new gallery of human health and evolutionary medicine, which is going to be part of kind of our centennial campaign at the museum. Kind of the new galleries, we're having a lot of new stuff happening at the Natural History Museum. So I'm part of bringing health and explaining how health fits here at the Natural History Museum.
I think that's important too, because I think a lot of people are unaware how connected medicine and, say, forensics or deduction actually are. And here, a lot of the early early forensics specialists
Right.
were doctors. Is that still true today?
Yes. So most scientists minimally are master's degrees, kind of depending on what type of field you work in. But yeah, most of us are doctors that were either not usually medical doctors unless you're a forensic pathologist, which is different than just being a pathologist. There's pathologists and then forensic pathologists. A forensic autopsy takes on average 2 hours longer than a regular autopsy. So if you're sitting through a forensic autopsy, it's usually about 4 hours. So they're intense, much longer to get through. But yeah, so for the most part, you're very highly trained, and it's very specific training of learning how to do your work in a way that holds up in a legal setting, which is a lot of what's different than being just a medical doctor. As a researcher, it's a very different system.
This is important to note too, because one of the problems that Spenzer faced, and actually this is also true of Norris and Gettler in New York, if you've been following the Deborah Blum book, is that Spenzer had to convince an audience not just that he was right about what he was looking at, but that it was also related to the crime. So it's one thing to say, yes, this is blood. It's another thing to prove the various reasons why the fact that it's blood means that Racer killed his fiancée.
And that hasn't stopped. I would say that we have something, if you're being trained, is called the CSI effect, which is the jury knows to request forensics, but they don't necessarily know what to request. So you can be an expert and get up there and be explaining, and they'll be like, why didn't you do this test? Because they've seen it on CSI, and you're like, that doesn't tell you what we're, like, that's not the question we're asking. So that's the CSI effect. And it really does affect how you have to do your work and think about your work. I've been asked, I'm a forensic anthropologist, so you get a lot of questions because of bones about, if you remember in the very early seasons, they had like a weird 3D hologram machine. That does not exist. And it was very hard to explain to juries that that doesn't exist. And that's why they did not have a 3D hologram of what happened at the trial. So
Have they ever asked for the reenactment? Like, could we see the reenactment? That would tell us so much.
But I've actually, see, that you can do when you're talking about reconstructions. I actually spent, this was way back too when I was training. I took our whole lab. We took our plastic skeletons out and we put a backdrop up, and we had to like walk through with like gluing the sticks on to show trajectories and what would happen, and like, yeah, we essentially acted it out with our plastic skeletons to show how the damage happened.
There's a series of famous dioramas. What are those called?
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I cannot think.
Now you're all going to have to Google this one.
Yeah.
There's a series of very famous dioramas which were created by a woman, actually, and it was to try and show people the importance of a crime scene.
Right.
Because it's hard to know. We all know now, like, oh, don't touch anything because there might be evidence. So
Right.
people get that. But imagine there was a time when people didn't get that. So the photographer would get there and they'd walk all over everything before anybody else got a chance to be there. Sherlock himself complains about this, and numerous of the accounts of people walking all over the crime scene. People do have a better understanding of that now, but that doesn't mean that you or I would necessarily know what to look for in a crime scene to know what had happened. And so you actually have to train people to have that level of detail.
Exactly. And it's natural too when people go into a situation, they want to help the person. So often they are not, like you said, they're panicked, right? They're just trying to help. So they don't know that when they're moving things, it changes things quite a bit. So you actually have to think about what's been moved, what hasn't been moved, why something might have been moved. All those type of things matter. And of course, it's not always people. Particularly as like a forensic anthropologist, you tend to work with bodies that have been left for a while. So they're generally decomposing, which also means that they might have had animal activity or insect activity, which will change the crime scenes quite a bit. More than you would think. If you have a dog, I guess you wouldn't be surprised at how much they can rearrange a room, but it makes a huge difference in reconstructing how that plays on top of each other. Like, so what happened that might be part of the cause of death, and what is after the fact does matter.
And John George Spenzer actually had his own sort of long-distance, somewhat forensic anthropology moment in history. There was a doctor here in Cleveland who was accused of murdering his wife in England. And he supposedly murdered her, cut her up into tiny pieces, buried her under the floorboards. And then the trial happened in London. He was found guilty, and they executed him there. Well, Spenzer decided to retry the trial because he was like, Clevelanders don't do this kind of thing. So he decided to retry the trial here in Cleveland, and he brought all of his people together. They ordered all the transcripts. They ordered copies of all the evidence. They went through and they redid the trial as forensics experts here in Cleveland, and they found him not guilty. Now, you might think that that's a funny story, except a few years ago, the case was reopened and they discovered that the body that had been found under the stairs wasn't even female. So in fact, Spenzer would have been right about that. We don't know what happened to the gentleman's wife, so who knows? But in this particular instance, you have a historical case of somebody trying forensically to go back in time, basically, to reconstruct events and find out what had happened.
Exactly. And of course, now too, not all... It's also about discerning the evidence that is important to what you're trying. So there might be, just because there's evidence of violence or that someone was present doesn't necessarily mean they did something. So there's a lot of layers, and you often, not often, but you can get experts that have contradictory evidence because not all lines of evidence necessarily tell you the same thing. So that's why you get experts on the stand disagreeing, because not everything is going to be in agreement necessarily.
Which comes back to the Kaiser pancreas that John George Spencer decided to keep in a jar for a year in his house, I guess. When that case finally came to fruition and it looked like very dark for Kaiser, he brought, just like ORFILA, he brought it to the courtroom and said, well, let's test it right here. And that was his way of kind of reasserting the man's innocence. But you can't always do that, actually. One of the more interesting books that, yeah, you really probably shouldn't. I don't think they will let you walk off with someone's pancreas today from an autopsy. Am I right?
They keep a lot of stuff.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
If it's a forensic autopsy,
sure,
it's a different thing. So they would take samples,
just have, like,
not the whole
souvenirs,
pancreas, but you would take any things that might be useful for toxicology or something. You would save small samples of, because they do retest things, which is why you'll see that happening. And you often don't have things to test against, which is a problem. So they might not have known what to test for. So you would keep it because you don't know what to test for till in the future, and then you can test it later.
There's a book called Beyond the Body Farm, which talks a little bit about the invention of body farm. If you don't know what a body farm is, it doesn't grow bodies, sadly. It's where bodies go to decompose. So it's one way that forensics experts can be trained to see a body in various states of decomposition. And in the book, one of the things that they talk about is that the CSI effect, again, tends to make you think that things happen really fast. Yeah. When in fact they don't. And so they were talking about how insects today can really tell us a lot. An insect presence in a body that's been left out in the open can tell us a lot of things, particularly based on the larvae and how developed they are. And he said, trust me, this was the result of one poor graduate student standing over bodies and collecting maggots for 3 years. It's like, this is not an immediate response kind of thing.
I can tell you from experience, collecting maggots is the worst job. I don't know anything. I have dealt with a lot of dead bodies, and the maggots are you never get used to maggots. Maggots are the worst. But yeah, so, and I think highlighting the fact that research is important is really valid to this. I think people think of end results and they're just like, but you need to validate all the tests. Like, you can't just do a test once, be like, that'll work, do it again. So anything that you're using in court, you need to validate. And you need to validate it for the specific conditions you're looking at and in the areas. So one of the issues with like the body farm, like you mentioned, it's in a very specific environment. So you have to test those methods in the desert, in the mountains, in a bog. Like, you need, because it changes things. And so there's a lot of research that goes into this and needs to be supported to do forensics that people don't think about. They think about casework, right? They think about the application. But, you have to be scientists and students have to actually spend a lot of time, years worth of research to make sure that all the results are valid and that we're not using things that aren't reproducible to convict people.
Well, we want to hear from you, and so one of the things I'd like to leave you with is a kind of interesting conundrum. If you are a follower of Sherlock Holmes and you really enjoy Sherlock Holmes, one of the things that those stories tend to relate is the idea that no one else can solve crimes like Sherlock. One of the things that CSI seems to relate is that all of you are experts and you know everything. So I think it's a kind of interesting difference.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
They're fantastic. So I think that that's an interesting division here between how those two fictions affected reality and in fact are still affecting reality. So what I'd like to do, I have 2 questions up here, but I also, you're not limited to those. I'd like you to turn around and kind of address this with some people nearby, to kind of make little groups and kind of have a mini chat session, warm yourself up. Then we're going to come back and I'll be answering, and Nicole will be answering some of your questions writ large. So just take about 5 minutes, kind of digest this a little bit and talk to one another, and then we'll bring you back to the larger group. Thank you. I know that wasn't much discussion time. I did also, I talked too long, that's why. The books are coming around that are photocopies of some of Spenzer's work. I couldn't bring the actual ones, they're a bit fragile, but we did take in-depth scans, so you feel free to have a look at these as they come around. We'd love to answer your questions. We've got Nicole, we've got myself. I'd be interested to hear, what kinds of things did you wonder about during this presentation, or what kind of questions do you have? And we will do that for the last, 10 or 15 minutes here. So, which one? Oh, this one. This is project number 3. I got to finish the second one first.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, let's get you the mic so we can hear your question.
Hi, I was just wondering if there was any possibility that for fellow researchers that this sort of might be scanned online and available to those of us who are more curious.
We are working on it. We have a system called Past Perfect. We're a bit behind schedule getting everything together in there. But in addition, if you are a researcher who would like to come down to the archive at the district, you can actually make an appointment and you can come down and see the actual artifacts, the actual boxes. We have an undergraduate student right now helping us to scan them into PDF like this to try and speed up the work. But yes, you are welcome to come see them in person, and eventually, hopefully, we'll have all of it, or at least most of it, up online, the visual stuff especially. Thanks, Nicole.
There you go.
I have a two-part question. What's the difference between a coroner and a medical examiner? And the second one is, we are blessed being in Cleveland to have so much medical talent here. What do you do if you're out in the middle of West Virginia or someplace where they don't have access to really good forensics?
That's a great question. I'm going to give that over to you, Nicole.
I have a really good answer to that question. Okay, so coroners technically do not have to be medical doctors. So a lot of places that have coroners, they could be anything and they run, so they're elected. And that sometimes they're appointed, but usually they're elected. So they could be a lawyer or anything. They're often professionals, so they're often like lawyers, something like that. They don't have a forensic or a medical background necessarily. They can. Medical examiners are doctors. They're usually forensic pathologists, specifically, like you would have here. And that usually has to do with size. So coroners are still common in like really like areas that aren't necessarily very populated, like you're talking about. Like, so if you're out in the country, you might have a coroner because the volume's down. And really all they have to do is flag something as suspicious and needing more investigation and to go to a forensic pathologist. They will ship the bodies out or send someone in. So they'll either go to a bigger county and have it analyzed by a forensic pathologist, or they will have someone come in and analyze it. So there's a big enough system that that's what happens. So you get extra people called in if you're in a tiny place, and if you're in a big place like Cleveland, there is like, we have a huge medical examiner's office. It's awesome. They give tours and they do outreach. So if you're interested in these type of things, go to the medical examiner's website and you can find all sorts of interesting things.
The book I was saying earlier, Beyond the Body Farm, has a couple of cases where they had to go into Appalachia and they literally like airlifted equipment down to take care of some of that stuff that was out in the country. So
I was a coroner's assistant for a while, and she was a coroner, so she wasn't fully trained. This was back when I was an undergrad, and she was a lovely lady, and she was about this tall on me, and the two of us would go out and collect bodies and do that together. And there was a rule that you had to wear office attire then. So we were in our dresses and heels because we were both women, which means we had to wear dresses because we worked for the government. Yeah.
that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Other questions? Other questions?
I have many questions, but I'll start with one. So I'm interested in how prescient do you think some of these television shows are in terms of imagining the future of forensics, what isn't quite here yet, but that they sort of suggest is, in the sense that, I mean, similar things have happened in the history of science fiction, right? Even in the literary period, we're talking about many years ago, people imagining things that were actually very accurate in terms of where we would go, some that were way off the mark. So I guess I'm interested in seeing, where are we at in terms of, what the future holds and how these television and film depictions maybe are imagining accurately or completely inaccurately where the future of forensics is going.
I'll answer part of that, and I'll let Nicole answer part of that. So here at Case Western Reserve University, we have HoloLens, and this is a new Microsoft technology that is allowing you to dissect a body that isn't there. And this is really, I've seen it. It's amazing. Actually, at the Dittrich Museum coming up in the, not just the Dittrich Museum, but the Allen Library at downtown at Case Western, is going to do a demonstration and a talk on this in the spring. So you're actually, if you were interested in this, you want to see this new 3D technology. So some of it is definitely coming. The person just behind you was talking about that too. Some of this is coming, but I think we can also look historically. I mean, Sherlock Holmes did not actually discover how to precipitate hemoglobin, but it was coming. I mean, it happened, maybe, not very long after that time period. So I think some of it is you just get it in the air. Everyone's interested, everybody's looking around, and that tends to sort of pull people into research and development. Nikki?
I would agree that like a lot of this, and it was already the way things are going. Faster testing is always better. And that's true of all aspects of law enforcement. The faster anything can get done, the better. So we're always developing faster tests, faster scanning, the same thing when you're doing DNA analysis, that sort of thing. You always want faster. Some things aren't going to advance like that. Like in anthropology, we're more of an observational science in that you have to actually spend time looking at the remains and thinking about them and looking at trauma and reconstructing it. So it's not a tool issue, but in things that specifically use testing and tools, I think it's very good. But I think in areas that are a little bit more observational, that's just human driven. So it's just however fast humans work.
Great. Other questions?
Did you have
a question?
Just to follow up on what both of you said, every TV program on the planet today is talking to consultants. And if they don't have their thumb on the pulse of what's going on in the area they're consulting in, they're collecting a huge fee with no right to get it. So.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that why are we seeing, this is also true of our fears, right, in life. And one of the other areas that both I and actually Andrea Wood here have discussed before is if you look at monster movies, right, that can tell you a lot about what it is that we're afraid of. The action movies were about invasion of, during the Cold War, a lot of them were about invasion. Now it seems to be a lot of it's like outbreaks. And, you got this kind of sense that what we fear and what we desire does show up in our entertainment. And now with Facebook and social media, it happens much, much faster. And so I do think that it drives interest in certain areas. And so one of the plus sides of the CSI effect, and it has many downsides, is that there's a lot more people showing up as undergrads in college being like, I want to be a CSI person, and that's good. That means that you have more people in the field. Yeah.
My question has to do with a murder that happened or supposedly happened. This woman was found at the bottom of a staircase with profuse bleeding around the head and so forth. Her husband was convicted of the crime because he had a mistress. And my question is that in this case, there was an ornithologist who, by accident, was walking at night. His hat was torn off. It turns out it was a great horned owl. He was really convinced that this woman who had been outside walking had been actually killed by this great horned owl, tried to get upstairs for help, and my question really is, in this kind of a thing, his testimony was listened to after the fact, after the man was convicted. How often are amateurs, how often is their experience looked at in official forensic cases?
That's pretty fascinating. Nikki, I think that's more your wheelhouse, because if amateurs' testimony actually mattered more in the period before specific people were doing certain kinds of science. And so you'd see much more of that actually earlier than I think you do today.
And I think partially the difference is, I would say amateurs are very uncommon, but occasional experts are not. So being a forensic expert is just being able to apply your science or your field to the medical legal system so that you can try a case, right? That's what the forensics part is. Some of us, that's obviously a very big part of what we do, and it would happen pretty often. So if you're a forensic biologist and you do DNA testing, you're going to get called on the top. So you're going to be a regular expert witness. You can be a kind of an irregular expert witness in that, like, there's only specific cases where the type of work you do might come up. But that's different than being an amateur. Most people still are highly trained. You would have like a PhD or whatever your highest degree is in whatever it is that you're applying. So that's what I would say. So amateurs would just be a witness. But if you're an expert and you're getting called in for something specifically that's maybe not as regular, that's still an expert witness, just maybe not in a field that's a regular field of forensics. Does that make sense? Okay.
Any other questions? We are running short on time, so I was hoping we could maybe get to one more. Anybody have a burning desire to ask
This
a question?
corner has been very question-free.
Very, very quiet over there.
I'm just going to say that.
Anyone?
No.
All right, we'll go over there. You're off the hook. I was going to do the Jeopardy theme song, but
I waited. I'm really interested in the way in which now we have this super saturation of visual representations of forensic processes. And I'm wondering, was there something similar going on when forensics started becoming more popularly used in the judicial system? Was it also visually depicted for the public as much? And if not, why not? And if so, in what sort of venues? In the paper, in journals? I'm not really sure.
you know, McLuhan's magazine is actually on Google, and you can look at that one. There are many, many, many visual representations of cases. They loved to depict courtroom drama, not just in the regular papers. I showed you some that were that's just a plain dealer, or a paper in Medina and some in Akron. But if you look internationally, the much larger papers, they love these big trials. There were like paintings and things done of that earlier trial where Matthew ORFILA comes in and says she's poisoned her husband. This was a big deal. People loved this kind of stuff, and they were fascinated by it. And this also, this is kind of off topic, but not entirely. There was a rash of vitriol throwings in vitriolic acid. It kind of melts your face off. It also appears in a Sherlock Holmes story. I'm blanking on not the illustrious client, one of them. And anyway, this is Kitty Winters does it. I forget whatever story Kitty Winters is in. She throws vitriol on someone who jilted her. Anyway, this rash of vitriol throwings was depicted in the papers. And it was almost always depicted in the papers as beautiful, jilted women were getting it back at these horrible men who had mistreated them. And they were always sort of, the pictures were always really brightly colored. Frequently they would get front page headlines, and it would be this woman in a white dress like throwing, or the man going like this. And they got copycats as a result. So there were people who claimed that the papers were literally fueling this rash of vitriol throwings. And this is especially interesting because, in fact, there were very few cases of women throwing vitriol. It was much, much, much more likely that loom breaker, people who had been cast out of jobs, would go after their employers. And they were usually men, but that's not as fun to depict in papers. So you literally, on the stand at one of the trials, a woman claimed, she says, it wasn't my fault. It was in the Paris paper and it looked like a good idea. And she didn't know what the vitriol was actually going to do, which is horrible. It literally just it's not a good thing. But yes, so there's a case where, in fact, all these visual representations supposedly and even actually led to additional crimes and were portrayed very romantically in the papers, even though it's a really, really devastating way to hurt somebody.
I would agree that it's constant. It has never. I would say that our media has changed, but that it's always been super popular. People like mysteries.
People love mysteries, don't you? Thank you so much for coming. You guys have been a great audience. Thank you so much. Let me just encourage you, please do come down. I am at the Dittrich Museum of Medical History across the street from Severance Hall. We are open Monday through Friday till 4:30. It's 9 to 4:30. till 7 on Wednesdays, and 10 to 2 on Saturdays. Again, right across the street from Severance Hall on Euclid and Adelbert. Nikki is from?
Of natural history. We are also open every day of the week from most of the times. We're open late on Wednesdays, so most of you probably have jobs, but after 5, you can come on Wednesdays. We also hold adult programs, and we do things like Think and Drink events, which are adult
Go ahead, give the whole
themed.
title.
Huh?
Do it, give the whole title.
Well,
Think and
Drink with the Extinct.
Yeah.
We have a forensic themed one coming up in September. So if you are interested in more forensic time and seeing me doing stuff with forensics, that's coming up in September. I don't remember the exact date because I'm terrible at dates, but that is happening.
On the website, on the website. Also, we at the Dittrich are partnering with the Botanical Gardens for Hoppy Hour on October 26th. I'm doing a program, a man named John George Spenzer is going to show up in full costume. And it's called Beer, Botanicals, and Bathtub Gin. So if you're interested, if you're a member of the Dittrich Museum, you get into that event for free. So become a member. And then you also get lots of emails from me. And again, thank you, Nikki, so much. Thank you all. I hope you will come and join us for more events. And you'll get to our websites, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.